Welcome to the Brief News Network.
If you want to recognize what a geopolitical earthquake actually looks like, do not watch the high-profile diplomatic summits. Do not listen to the carefully rehearsed statements delivered at press conferences. Watch the cars. Specifically, 49,000 of them. For decades, the border separating the United States and Canada has functioned as a frictionless conveyor belt. An automotive component crosses that northern boundary up to 7 distinct times before it ultimately emerges as a finished vehicle ready for the showroom floor. It is the absolute circulatory system of the North American economy. But as of this week, that historic conveyor belt has collided with a concrete wall. And that wall was erected by the United States Ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, who stepped up to a podium and formally announced that Washington is blocking Canadian-assembled vehicles from entering American territory. That ain't going to happen, he declared. It is a wholly unprecedented blockade. And the underlying cause is this. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney traveled to Beijing and quietly pried open a back door to the one thing the United States has been working relentlessly to keep out: cheap, massively subsidized Chinese electric vehicles. This is not a contained trade skirmish over tariff percentages. This is the fracturing of the entire United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. If you want unfiltered coverage without the partisan packaging, subscribe now, because this story is accelerating faster than most mainstream outlets can track. Here is precisely what is unfolding at the northern border, and why the arithmetic of 49,000 vehicles changes absolutely everything. Let me walk you back through history for a moment so you can fully grasp what is genuinely at stake here. If you drive a Ford, a Chevrolet, or a Chrysler today, you are not driving an American car in any strict sense of the term. You are driving a North American car. That distinction is not semantic. It is the structural foundation of the entire continental economy. There is a bridge connecting Detroit, Michigan to Windsor, Ontario. It is called the Ambassador Bridge. It is an imposing, utilitarian span of private infrastructure suspended above the Detroit River. It lacks architectural beauty, but it is arguably the single most consequential artery of physical commerce on the planet. Every day, hundreds of millions of dollars in goods transit that bridge. But the real economic miracle, the phenomenon that has defined the U.S.-Canada relationship for more than half a century, is what is happening inside the massive semi-trucks rumbling across that pavement around the clock. When a vehicle is assembled in North America, it is not built in a single fixed location. We operate on what is called a just-in-time manufacturing model. An engine block might be cast in a Michigan foundry, shipped across the border into Ontario to be machined and refined, routed south to Mexico for further assembly, and then returned to Ohio to be lowered into a finished chassis. The border effectively ceases to exist for these components. We describe it as a frictionless border, a highly synchronized, enormously profitable, extraordinarily intricate choreography that was first formalized back in 1965 through the trade arrangement known as the Auto Pact, subsequently consolidated under NAFTA in the 1990s, and re-anchored by the USMCA just a few years ago. The entire integrated structure rests on a single, non-negotiable premise: trust. The United States and Canada must function as one unified economic fortress. They share the same safety standards. They protect the same blue-collar workforce. They defend the same perimeter against external economic incursions. If this kind of structural breakdown is helping you see past the surface noise, hit the like button. It signals me to keep delivering these systemic explanations that cable networks consistently gloss over. Because that fortress, that shared continental perimeter we have defended alongside Canada for generations, has just been breached from the inside. Until very recently, Washington and Ottawa stood shoulder to shoulder against the single most significant existential threat facing the legacy global auto industry: the People's Republic of China. The Chinese government has spent the better part of a decade heavily, systematically, and relentlessly subsidizing its domestic electric vehicle sector. Companies like BYD and NIO are producing sleek, technologically advanced, feature-rich electric vehicles at consumer price points that American legacy automakers simply cannot compete with. This is state-sponsored market saturation on a scale the world has not previously encountered. The United States identified this threat early and erected a formidable barrier, a 100% tariff wall on Chinese electric vehicles. The message to Beijing was unambiguous. You will not flood our consumer market with state-subsidized automobiles and hollow out the city of Detroit. And Canada, as our closest strategic partner and the other pillar of our integrated auto sector, stood firmly beside us. They mirrored that 100% tariff. The perimeter was intact. The North American auto worker was shielded by a unified front. And then came January 2026. To understand what happened next, we need to examine the harsh political reality inside Canada with clear eyes. Prime Minister Mark Carney is navigating a domestic economy struggling to find solid footing and a population growing increasingly restless. He is facing crushing political pressure from major domestic industries that have nothing to do with automobiles or battery chemistry. Specifically, he is contending with the agricultural and seafood sectors. For months leading into this crisis, Beijing had been playing a ruthless diplomatic pressure game against Ottawa. Using its vast consumer market as a blunt instrument, China had effectively blocked or imposed punishing tariffs on Canadian canola oil and Canadian lobster. If you are sitting in a high-rise office in Toronto or a television studio in New York, that might register as an obscure agricultural footnote. But if you are a canola farmer on the plains of Saskatchewan or a lobsterman working the coast of Nova Scotia, it is a full-scale, unambiguous existential crisis. Your livelihood is being methodically strangled by Beijing. And the political pressure on Prime Minister Carney to resolve this specific crisis became unbearable as his approval ratings began their downward trajectory. So Carney made a decision. He flew to Beijing. He sat across from President Xi Jinping. And he struck a deal. When the news broke in Ottawa, the domestic Canadian press initially treated it as a sweeping diplomatic triumph, a genuine masterclass in international negotiation. China agreed to lift its punishing restrictions. It reopened its enormous, lucrative consumer market to Canadian agricultural products. The canola was welcomed back. The lobster was welcomed back. Prairie farmers celebrated. Maritime fishermen exhaled. The domestic political emergency was, for the moment, defused. But in global geopolitics, and especially when negotiating with Beijing, nothing is ever given without a corresponding extraction. There is always a strategic price. The cost of that agricultural relief was buried in the fine print of the trade arrangement. And when automotive executives in Detroit and trade officials in Washington finally read it, the color drained from their faces. Canada had not simply called in a diplomatic favor. They had traded away the fortress. In exchange for restored agricultural market access, Prime Minister Carney agreed to open a back channel into North America for Chinese electric vehicles. That impenetrable 100% tariff wall, the one that had mirrored United States policy precisely, was gone. Abolished. Slashed to a mere 6.1%. The architecture of the agreement permits a specific, carefully negotiated quota. 49,000 Chinese-manufactured electric vehicles are now legally authorized to enter the Canadian market annually at this drastically reduced duty rate. And that figure is not fixed. It is scheduled to escalate to 70,000 vehicles per year by 2031. To put that into proper context, tens of thousands of technologically sophisticated, artificially underpriced vehicles are now legally entitled to flow into a consumer market that is deeply, structurally, and physically interwoven with the United States. Let me state that plainly. Canada deliberately traded the structural integrity of the North American auto sector in exchange for cooking oil and crustaceans. They punched a gaping hole through the continental economic shield. The reaction from the American auto industry was instantaneous, unanimous, and furious. General Motors CEO Mary Barra did not hedge her language. She immediately issued a warning that this move poses a direct and immediate threat to manufacturing and labor across the continent. The United Auto Workers Union sounded a full alarm. Because the real terror in Detroit is not simply that Canadian consumers in Vancouver or Montreal will purchase affordable Chinese EVs instead of American-made Chevrolets. The genuine, paralyzing fear is the border itself. The fear is the Ambassador Bridge. If 49,000 Chinese vehicles are offloading from cargo ships at Western Canadian ports, what happens when those vehicles attempt to move south? What happens when Chinese automotive components, embedded within those vehicles or shipped alongside them for maintenance, begin infiltrating that frictionless continental conveyor belt. What prevents a Chinese-manufactured vehicle from entering Canada at a 6.1% duty rate, receiving a Canadian license plate, and then rolling directly into the United States, completely bypassing the American 100% tariff wall? This is the concept known as transshipment, and it represents the defining nightmare scenario for American trade enforcement officials. Washington suddenly recognized that its northern perimeter had been fundamentally compromised. The mandatory review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement is now only months away. What was supposed to be a routine procedural check-in among trusted allies has been transformed by Carney's Beijing deal into a potential detonation event. The United States now has the perfect justification to tear the entire agreement open for renegotiation. If Washington cannot explicitly verify what is crossing the Ambassador Bridge, it will begin inspecting everything. Every truck, every manifest, every shipment. And if you stop that conveyor belt, the North American auto industry does not simply decelerate, it catastrophically seizes. The Canadian government, predictably, is working to contain the panic. Ottawa insists this is a tightly controlled, carefully managed arrangement. They argue vigorously that these 49,000 vehicles are strictly designated for Canadian domestic consumption. They are pledging meticulous tracking protocols. They are implementing import permit frameworks. They are repeating, loudly and consistently, "Do not be alarmed, America. These cars will not cross your border." But here is where this story takes a decisive turn. And this is the contradiction at the heart of this crisis that is far more consequential than it initially appears. Because the United States government is not solely worried about underpriced steel and subsidized lithium-ion battery packs undermining Ford and Chrysler. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra did not step to the podium and threaten to unilaterally seal the integrated border simply to defend corporate market share. He reached for a very specific, very deliberate, and deeply alarming phrase when he announced the blockade. He did not characterize these vehicles as an economic threat to American labor. He called them great gobblers of data. And that brings us to the dimension of this story that most people are entirely missing, and the genuinely alarming reason why Hoekstra's historic border blockade may not only be threatened but actually executed. When Ambassador Hoekstra deploys a phrase like great gobblers of data, he is not reaching for theatrical language. He is signaling a fundamental reconceptualization of what a car actually is in the 21st century. For 100 years, an automobile was a mechanical object. Steel, glass, rubber, and a combustion engine. But a modern electric vehicle, and especially a Chinese-manufactured EV, is essentially a high-powered, perpetually internet-connected mobile supercomputer that happens to travel on four wheels. It is equipped with cameras, ultrasonic sensors, LiDAR arrays, and GPS transponders. It continuously maps its physical surroundings, records ambient audio, and harvests biometric data from its occupants. And most critically, it is in constant communication with servers located in a country that the United States has formally designated as a foreign adversary. This is precisely why the 49,000 vehicle quota is not merely an economic headache for Detroit. It is a blazing red alert for the National Security Agency. Washington's fear is that these vehicles are, in effect, mobile surveillance platforms. If permitted to transit freely across the Canadian border and into American territory, they would not simply be transporting passengers. They would potentially be harvesting data on American infrastructure, military installations, and high-value individuals, a Trojan horse operation concealed within the appealing packaging of an affordable green energy transition. And this is where the strategic calculus behind Prime Minister Carney's deal begins to look genuinely hazardous to the long-term health of the U.S.-Canada relationship. By permitting these data harvesting machines into the North American perimeter, Canada has effectively introduced a contaminant into a shared system. Until now, the border operated frictionlessly because both nations shared a common definition of what constituted a security threat. Canada held trusted partner status. A truck rolling out of Ontario into Michigan received minimal scrutiny because both sides had absolute confidence in the origin of its components and the nature of its embedded technology. But the moment those 49,000 Chinese vehicles begin operating on Canadian roads, that mutual trust begins to erode. If U.S. Customs and Border Protection cannot guarantee with absolute certainty that a vehicle or component shipment crossing the Ambassador Bridge is free of Chinese state-linked software or surveillance hardware, they have precisely one remaining option. They check everything. Every manifest. Every sensor array. Every embedded line of code. If you want to understand how you collapse the North American economy within 48 hours, that is your mechanism. You convert a 3-minute border crossing into a 6-hour inspection process. You shatter the just-in-time manufacturing model that keeps assembly plants operational from Windsor, Ontario to Huntsville, Alabama. This is not a theoretical worst-case scenario. We are standing at the edge of a massive diplomatic collision. In just a few months, the United States, Mexico, and Canada are legally obligated to convene and review the USMCA. It is a mandatory institutional check-in. And Washington has just delivered Ottawa an unambiguous warning. If Canada continues down the path of strategic alignment with Beijing, do not expect the preferential relationship with Washington to survive the renegotiation intact. We are witnessing a game of geopolitical brinkmanship in which the stakes are measured in millions of livelihoods and the very definition of North American sovereignty. Here is the full picture. Canada attempted to resolve a short-term domestic political problem, canola oil and lobster, but in doing so, it may have permanently fractured the most successful and enduring trade partnership in modern economic history. The United States is no longer debating tariff levels. It is discussing blockades. It is no longer focused exclusively on trade imbalances. It is invoking national security. If this breakdown helped you see the structural reality behind the headlines, please consider sharing this video. It is the only mechanism by which we cut through the noise of conventional news coverage. And I want to hear your perspective in the comments. Was Canada justified in prioritizing its farmers and fishermen? Or has Prime Minister Carney just executed the most consequential strategic miscalculation in Canadian history? We are entering a new era of continental friction, one in which the border is no longer merely a line drawn on a map. It is a firewall. And as the first of those 49,000 vehicles begin arriving at Canadian ports this spring, the pressure bearing down on that firewall is only going to intensify. The next move carries more weight than any that has come before it.
Welcome to the Brief News Network.